The second reading is from Romans. Moses writes concerning the righteousness that comes from the law, that the person who does these things will live by them. But the righteousness that comes from faith says, do not say in your heart, who will ascend into heaven? That is, to bring Christ down. Or, who will descend into the abyss? That is, to bring Christ up from the dead. But what does it say? The word is near you, on your lips and in your heart. That is the word of faith that we proclaim. Because if you confess with your lips that Jesus is Lord and believe in your heart that God raised him from the dead, you will be saved. For one believes with the heart and so is justified, and one confesses with the mouth and so is saved. The scripture says, no one who believes in him will be put to shame. For there is no distinction between Jew and Greek. The same Lord is Lord of all and is generous to all who call on him. For everyone who calls on the name of the Lord shall be saved. But how are they to call on one in whom they have not believed? And how are they to believe in one of whom they have never heard? And how are they to hear without someone to proclaim him? And how are they to proclaim him unless they have been sent? As it is written, how beautiful are the feet of those who bring good news. Here ends the reading.
The gospel comes to us from St. Matthew, from the 14th chapter today. Immediately, Jesus made the disciples get into the boat and go on to the other side while he dismissed the crowds. And after he had dismissed the crowds, he went up the mountain by himself to pray. When evening came, he was there alone, but by this time the boat, battered by the waves, was far from the land, for the wind was against them. And early in the morning he came walking toward them on the sea. But when the disciples saw him walking on the sea, they were terrified, saying, "It is a ghost!" And they cried out in fear. But immediately Jesus spoke to them and said, "Take heart, it is I, do not be afraid." Peter answered him, "Lord, if it is you, command me to come to you on the water." And Jesus said, "Come." So Peter got out of the boat, started walking on the water, and came toward Jesus. But when he noticed the strong wind, he became frightened. And beginning to sink, he cried out, "Lord, save me!" Jesus immediately reached out his hand and caught him, saying to him, "You of little faith, why did you doubt?" When they got into the boat, the wind ceased. And those in the boat worshipped him, saying, "Truly you are the Son of God." Here ends the reading of the gospel. Let us be seated. I love Elijah. Of course, I love the prophets. The prophets have a very distinctive way of conferring the message of God to the people. And they have a way of, their delivery is always very interesting to watch and to listen to. But what's more interesting to me is how God calls the prophets, gets a hold of them, and then almost shakes them and says, "You've got a message, you've got to go deliver this." And in that way they believe. So a little bit of a catechism question first. Why is Elijah in the cave in the first place? He's running. Who's he running from? A queen and a king. Neil, you don't answer. You heard this last night. A king and a queen. The king is Ahab. The queen is that woman that nobody wants to be called. Jezebel. Jezebel, remember, she died finally after all of this brouhaha going on. She fell out of a window and the dogs ate her body. I mean, she just dies in this horrible way. But she comes to Israel from a foreign country bringing her god Baal, remember? that Elijah was on the hilltop with the prophets and priests of Baal, and they were all there together with 2 different piles of wood, and they said, "Let's see whose God is better." And what did they find out? The prophets of Baal running around and cutting themselves and dancing and singing and doing everything all day long, trying to get their god Baal to bring fire down from heaven, never did a thing. As a matter of fact, Elijah taunted them with things like, well, maybe your God's on vacation. Maybe he went to the toilet. Maybe he just is not listening to you. He said all these things to them while they're dancing and while they're in their religious service. And finally, when it came Elijah's time, Elijah said, "Go get several buckets of water and pour it all over my pile of wood. Pour it all over it and all around it, and I'm going to pray, and God will send down fire, and we will see who the God of Israel is." And what happens? The fire comes down. And the fire was enough not only to light that wet wood, but it licked up all the water around it, and it caught on fire all of the wood that was on that hill. All the wood that they had put together for the purpose of defeating God. God came with force. And so because of this, Jezebel and Ahab are hunting down Elijah. Elijah goes and stays in the cave, and God asks the same question twice to him. "What are you doing here?" And each time, Elijah gives him exactly the same answer. "Oh, I'm the last one. I'm the only one who loves you. I'm the only one. I'm the last of the prophets. I'm the one who really cares about your message." And the first time, God says to him what? "Go out at the mouth of the cave, because God is going to pass by." Now, God, it says, was not in the wind that came. God was not in the earthquake that came. God was not in the fire that came. Where was God? Because after that, it says there was a sheer silence. And it didn't say after there was a sheer silence that God came. But it does say something that's very interesting. It says, Elijah wrapped himself in his mantle. And I remember seeing a painting one time, Elijah wrapped like this. Kind of looks like Dracula. He's wrapped like this. But the word in Hebrew for mantle that is used in this text is the word that also means glory. He wrapped himself in the glory. God appeared in the silence. God appeared in that which Elijah did not expect. Elijah expects God to be this one who sends winds that are big enough to tear down trees, and earthquakes that are big enough to tear down buildings, and fires that are big enough to burn down forests. God is this great God, except that this time God comes in the sheer silence. Now, if we skip forward to the gospel, we see almost the same thing going on. The disciples have never seen somebody walk on water before. Obviously, they've never seen Neil and me. We walk on water. They have never seen somebody walk on water before. They have never encountered anything like this. So when they see Jesus coming on the water, they think he's a ghost. And think about this for a moment. You're in the boat and you've drifted way out into the water. Jesus is still back on the shore dismissing crowds, you think, and you're way out in the water and it's early in the morning. The fog is lifting up off the water. I know you've seen this before. And all of a sudden someone's coming across the water, something you've never seen. And you think, could that be somebody out there? And it gets a little closer and you say, it looks like a ghost. And they get afraid. Because who's not scared of a ghost, right? And as they call out and within themselves, Jesus says to them, don't be afraid. Don't be afraid. That phrase that's used every time we encounter the impossible, that phrase that's used every time an angel meets with somebody, the time that God is in front of somebody. Don't be afraid. And it reminds us when we're in the presence of God, don't be afraid. I'm sure that many of us are afraid in the presence of God, that we are whenever we encounter something like Dave Dote's story, to have pancreatic cancer, and we become afraid. We're in the presence of God at that moment. It's God saying to us, stop, slow down, listen. Or whenever a baby is born, look at what God has given to us. Or whenever we have a marriage. Ange and Stormy were married just recently, and we stood here in the presence of God and the assembly. And we think to ourselves, why did it take so long? Just kidding, Ange. But we also, in the presence of God, many times in our lives don't even realize it. Like with Elijah in that silence. Like with those disciples in that boat, rocking back and forth, and didn't realize that Jesus would come walking to them on the water and then says, don't be afraid. And then he takes it up a notch and says to Peter, come on. After Peter says, if it really is you, I want to come out there to you. And Peter does what we generally do. We get overwhelmed by what's going on around us, that we forget we're in the presence of God. We get overwhelmed with all the things that bother us, the things that we don't like, the things that tend to get under our skin, and we forget we're in the presence of God. We're in that sheer silence. We're in that do not be afraid moment. We've all been there. We've all been there, and maybe some of us are there today. I mean, there aren't many people here today, and they're watching by internet. It's part of the reason. We don't sometimes realize we're in the presence of God. But also, they realize they're in the presence of God, and they want to protect themselves, and that's okay. But let us not, in the fear, let us not ever think that God is not protecting us wherever we are. Let us not think that somehow I'm better than this one or that one because I think I've got more protection. God is always with us. God is always there beside us. God is always saying to us, do not be afraid. So let us not be afraid. Let us be those kind of people like Elijah, who wrap ourselves in the glory of God. Let's be like Peter. If it's really you, let me come walking to you. And when we do fall, and we will, we know that Jesus is always there to pick us up. Because the very first thing that Jesus did was not chastise Peter. The very first thing he did when Peter fell under the water, he bent down and he lifted him up. And I believe he gently said to him, why did you doubt? You have little faith. Why did you doubt? I'm right here. And I've always told you, don't be afraid. Amen.